There are people right now lying in bed at 3 in the morning, scripting entire conversations that haven't happened yet. They're crafting perfect responses, anticipating every possible reaction, rehearsing tone and timing, playing out scenarios in their mind like a director preparing for a performance. And if you think this is just careful planning or social awareness, the neuroscience reveals something far darker. The brain that can't stop rehearsing conversations is a brain that's trapped in a cycle of threat prediction, where every social interaction feels like a high-stakes performance that requires preparation to survive. Today, we're dissecting the psychology of conversational rehearsal, and the research shows this isn't about being prepared. It's about being terrified. Let me start with research that reveals how common and consuming this behavior is. A 2020 study published in the journal Consciousness and Cognition surveyed over 4,000 individuals about their internal dialogue patterns. They found that 89% of people reported occasionally rehearsing conversations before they happened, but 32% reported doing this compulsively, spending hours per day scripting and re-scripting upcoming interactions. For this subset, conversational rehearsal wasn't occasional preparation. It was a mental prison that consumed cognitive resources and generated significant anxiety. The researchers used experience sampling, pinging participants throughout the day and asking what they were thinking about. High rehearsers spent an average of 4.2 hours per day mentally simulating future conversations, often the same conversation repeatedly with minor variations. This wasn't productive planning. It was rumination focused on future rather than past events, what researchers call anticipatory processing, or pre-conversation anxiety. Before we go deeper, you need to understand what's happening neurologically when you rehearse conversations. Research published in 2019 in Social Cognitive and Affective Neuroscience used fMRI imaging while participants mentally simulated future social interactions. The brain regions that activated were remarkably similar to those used during actual conversations. The temporoparietal junction for perspective taking, the medial prefrontal cortex for mentalizing about others' thoughts, the superior temporal sulcus for processing social information. But here's what's crucial. There was also heightened activation in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, and the anterior cingulate cortex, involved in conflict monitoring and error detection. The brain wasn't just simulating conversation. It was treating the simulation as a potential threat, constantly scanning for things that could go wrong, monitoring for social danger. The mental rehearsal was essentially threat detection training, preparing the brain to identify and avoid social catastrophe. The study also found that during conversational rehearsal, the default mode network, typically associated with mind-wandering and self-referential thinking, showed unusual activation patterns. Instead of the relaxed, meandering thought characteristic of typical mind-wandering, the rehearsal showed tightly focused, repetitive simulation. The brain was stuck in a loop, unable to move past the anticipated interaction until it felt adequately prepared. Now let's talk about why some people rehearse conversations compulsively while others don't. A groundbreaking 2018 study published in the Journal of Anxiety Disorders identified several key factors. The strongest predictor was social anxiety. Individuals with high social anxiety were 6.7 times more likely to engage in compulsive conversational rehearsal compared to low anxiety individuals. Their brain's threat detection system was hyperactive, perceiving ordinary social interactions as dangerous situations requiring extensive preparation. But the study found that social anxiety alone didn't fully explain the behavior. Perfectionism, particularly socially prescribed perfectionism, where you believe others expect perfection from you, significantly contributed. Perfectionists rehearsed conversations trying to craft the perfect response, the ideal tone, the flawless delivery. But perfection in spontaneous conversation is impossible, so the rehearsal became endless, chasing an unattainable standard. The third factor was intolerance of uncertainty. People who needed predictability and control, who found ambiguous situations distressing, used conversational rehearsal as an attempt to make the unpredictable predictable. If they could script the conversation perfectly, anticipate every response, plan every contingency, maybe they could control the outcome. Of course, real conversations don't follow scripts, which made the rehearsal ultimately futile, but the illusion of control reduced anxiety in the moment. The fourth factor was past negative social experiences. Individuals who had experienced social rejection, humiliation, or conflict showed higher rates of conversational rehearsal. Their brain had learned that unprepared social interaction was dangerous, and rehearsal became a protective strategy. The memory of past social pain drove compulsive preparation to prevent future pain. Let's examine the specific content of rehearsed conversations, because what people rehearse reveals their deepest social fears. A 2021 qualitative study published in Cognitive Therapy and Research asked compulsive rehearsers to describe their internal scripts. Several patterns emerged. The most common was rehearsing difficult conversations, confrontations, boundary setting, requests, apologies, rejections. These high-stakes interactions generated the most anxiety and the most elaborate rehearsal. But participants also rehearsed mundane conversations, small talk at parties, casual interactions with acquaintances, routine work conversations. Even low-stakes interactions triggered rehearsal if uncertainty was involved. The common thread wasn't the objective importance of the conversation, but the perceived risk of social failure, judgment, or rejection. The study found that rehearsed scripts typically included multiple versions. Best-case scenarios where the conversation went perfectly, worst-case scenarios where everything went wrong, and various middle scenarios. Participants would cycle through these versions repeatedly, trying to prepare for every possibility. But this created a paradox. The more versions they prepared, the more anxious they became because they'd identified more ways things could go wrong. Research on the cognitive costs of conversational rehearsal reveals significant impacts. A 2020 study published in Applied Cognitive Psychology measured working memory capacity, attention, and cognitive flexibility in high rehearsers versus low rehearsers. High rehearsers showed impaired performance across all measures. The constant mental simulation of conversations consumed cognitive resources, leaving less capacity available for present-moment tasks. The researchers used dual-task paradigms where participants completed cognitive tasks while either rehearsing conversations or not rehearsing. During rehearsal periods, performance dropped by an average of 34% on attention tasks, 41% on working memory tasks, and 52% on cognitive flexibility tasks. The brain was so occupied with the imagined future conversation that it couldn't fully engage with present reality. Participants reported real-world impacts, difficulty concentrating at work, missing information in current conversations because they were mentally rehearsing future ones, forgetting tasks because their mind was occupied with scripts. The rehearsal wasn't helping them perform better in conversations. It was impairing their overall cognitive function. Now let's talk about the anxiety paradox. Conversational rehearsal is motivated by anxiety reduction, but research shows it actually increases anxiety. A 2019 study in behavior research and therapy examined the relationship between rehearsal and anxiety using longitudinal tracking. They found that rehearsal provided immediate short-term anxiety reduction, which reinforced the behavior through negative reinforcement. The person felt temporarily better after rehearsing, so they rehearsed more. But across longer time frames, rehearsal predicted increased anxiety about the upcoming conversation. The more someone rehearsed, the more anxious they became as the actual interaction approached. The mechanism appeared to be that rehearsal increased the perceived importance and stakes of the conversation. Something that started as a routine interaction became, through extensive rehearsal, a high-pressure performance where everything had to go according to script. The study also found that rehearsal increased disappointment and rumination after conversations. Because the person had created elaborate mental scripts, the actual conversation, which inevitably deviated from the script, felt like a failure. They'd ruminate about how reality differed from their rehearsal, analyzing what went wrong, often planning to rehearse even more for future interactions to prevent similar deviations. The cycle perpetuated itself. Let's examine brain imaging research on what happens when rehearsed conversations don't go according to script. A 2020 study published in Social Neuroscience had participants rehearse conversations, then engage them in actual conversations that deliberately deviated from expected patterns. Brain imaging showed that when reality violated the rehearsed script, there was a spike in amygdala activation along with increased activity in the anterior cingulate cortex, indicating error detection and distress. Physiologically, participants showed elevated heart rate, increased skin conductance, and cortisol spikes when conversations went off script. Their body was responding to the deviation as a threat. The more extensively they'd rehearsed, the stronger the stress response when reality diverged from rehearsal. The preparation that was supposed to reduce anxiety actually made them more rigid and more distressed when the inevitable unpredictability of human interaction occurred. The study found that low rehearsers who engaged in minimal or no pre-conversation scripting showed more flexible responses when conversations took unexpected turns. They could adapt in the moment because they weren't trying to follow a predetermined script. Their lack of rigid expectations allowed for more authentic, responsive engagement. The preparation was actually impairing conversational quality. Research on the social consequences of conversational rehearsal provides important insights. A 2021 study in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships examined how rehearsal affected actual conversation quality. Trained observers watched video-recorded conversations and rated them on various dimensions: naturalness, engagement, responsiveness, authenticity, connection quality. They were blind to which participants were high rehearsers. The findings were striking. Conversations involving high rehearsers were rated significantly lower on all dimensions. They appeared less natural, more scripted, less responsive to their conversation partner, less authentic. The rehearsal showed. Partners reported feeling like the person was performing rather than genuinely connecting, following a script rather than having a real conversation. The study also measured brain synchrony between conversation partners using dual EEG recording. In natural, flowing conversations, the brains of conversation partners show synchronized activity patterns, particularly in regions processing social information. This neural synchrony is associated with feelings of connection and successful communication. In conversations with high rehearsers, this synchrony was significantly reduced. The rehearser's brain was following their internal script rather than synchronizing with their partner. Let's talk about the specific fears driving conversational rehearsal. A 2019 study published in Clinical Psychology Review identified core catastrophic beliefs underlying the behavior. The most common was fear of saying something stupid or embarrassing that would lead to permanent judgment or rejection. Participants believed that one wrong word could destroy relationships, careers, or reputations. The stakes felt existentially high. The second fear was being caught off guard or not knowing what to say, which would reveal incompetence or inadequacy. Silence or hesitation felt dangerous, like it would expose some fundamental defect. The rehearsal was an attempt to eliminate the possibility of being speechless. Third was fear of conflict or disapproval. Participants believed that if they didn't say exactly the right thing in exactly the right way, the other person would become angry or withdraw. The relationship felt perpetually fragile, dependent on perfect verbal performance. The researchers identified these as cognitive distortions, catastrophic thinking patterns that overestimated both the probability and severity of negative outcomes. They used cognitive restructuring to challenge these beliefs. What's the actual evidence that one awkward comment destroys relationships? How many times has not having a perfect response led to the catastrophic outcome you fear? Are you holding yourself to a standard you don't hold others to? But they found that cognitive challenges alone had limited effectiveness. The beliefs were maintained by the rehearsal itself. Because people always rehearsed before difficult conversations, they never tested whether unrehearsed conversations actually led to catastrophe. The rehearsal prevented the learning that would disconfirm their fears. They couldn't discover that spontaneity was safe because they never allowed themselves to be spontaneous. Research on treatment approaches shows what works. A 2021 randomized controlled trial published in Behavior Therapy tested an intervention specifically targeting conversational rehearsal. The treatment combined several elements: psychoeducation about how rehearsal maintains anxiety, behavioral experiments where participants had unrehearsed conversations and observed outcomes, mindfulness training to increase present moment awareness during conversations, and cognitive restructuring of catastrophic beliefs. The most powerful component was the behavioral experiments. Participants practiced having conversations with minimal or no rehearsal, starting with low-stakes interactions and gradually progressing to higher-stakes ones. The experiments tested predictions. If I don't rehearse this conversation, I'll say something stupid and embarrass myself. Then they had the conversation without rehearsing and observed what actually happened. In 87% of cases, the feared catastrophic outcome didn't occur. Unrehearsed conversations went fine, sometimes better than rehearsed ones because they were more natural and responsive. This repeated disconfirmation of feared outcomes was crucial for reducing rehearsal behavior. Participants' brains learned through experience that preparation wasn't necessary for conversational survival. Brain imaging before and after treatment showed changes in neural patterns. Amygdala reactivity to upcoming social interactions decreased. Prefrontal cortex activation during conversations became more focused on present moment processing rather than script following. Default mode network activity during rest periods decreased, suggesting less time spent in anticipatory rumination. The treatment was literally changing how the brain processed social interaction. Let's examine the relationship between conversational rehearsal and authenticity. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Personality found that high rehearsers scored significantly lower on authenticity measures. They reported feeling like they were performing a role rather than being themselves, presenting a carefully crafted version rather than their genuine thoughts and feelings. The constant scripting meant they were rarely spontaneous or unrehearsed, which made genuine self-expression difficult. The study included interviews where participants described their experience. Many used similar language. "I feel fake. I'm always acting. No one knows the real me. I'm exhausted from maintaining the performance." The rehearsal that was supposed to help them navigate social situations successfully was actually preventing genuine connection. They were so focused on saying the right thing that they couldn't say the true thing. Participants described a painful awareness that people responded to their performed self, not their authentic self. Compliments or positive feedback felt hollow because it wasn't really them being appreciated. Rejection or criticism felt devastating because they'd failed even while performing their best version. Either way, the authentic self remained hidden, unknown, and therefore unable to receive genuine connection or validation. Research on cultural factors reveals interesting variations. A 2019 cross-cultural study published in Culture and Cognition examined conversational rehearsal across 31 countries. They found higher rates in cultures with more rigid social hierarchies, stronger emphasis on propriety and face-saving, and less tolerance for social mistakes. In these contexts, the consequences of social missteps were objectively higher, making rehearsal more adaptive. However, even accounting for cultural context, there were individuals whose rehearsal was excessive relative to cultural norms, suggesting that personal psychological factors mattered beyond cultural influences. The study found that across all cultures, the relationship between rehearsal and anxiety held. More rehearsal predicted higher anxiety and lower conversational quality, regardless of cultural background. Now let's talk about the developmental origins of compulsive conversational rehearsal. A 2020 study published in Development and Psychopathology examined childhood experiences of adult high rehearsers. They found consistent patterns. Many grew up in environments where social mistakes had significant consequences. Parents who responded to children's verbal missteps with anger, punishment, humiliation, or withdrawal taught the developing brain that words were dangerous and needed careful monitoring. Some participants described parents who were hypercritical of their speech. "That's not how you say it. Don't talk like that. Think before you speak," delivered with frustration or contempt. The child learned that spontaneous speech was dangerous and that extensive internal editing was necessary before speaking. Others described environments where they had to manage volatile parental emotions through careful verbal navigation, learning to script their words to avoid triggering outbursts. The study found that these early experiences created lasting changes in how the brain approached communication. The child's developing neural systems learned to treat conversation as a minefield requiring careful navigation, rather than a natural form of connection. By adulthood, this had become automatic, outside conscious awareness. They didn't remember deciding to rehearse conversations. It was simply how their brain approached social interaction. Let's examine research on what happens during the actual rehearsed conversation. A 2021 study in Emotion used experience sampling during conversations that participants had extensively rehearsed. Despite all the preparation, participants reported high anxiety during the actual conversation, particularly when it deviated from script. They described their experience as split attention, with part of their mind engaged in the conversation and part constantly comparing reality to their rehearsed version. This split attention impaired conversational quality. They missed social cues from their partner because they were internally focused on their script. They experienced delays in responding because they were searching their rehearsed content for the appropriate line. They felt disconnected from the conversation because they were observing and evaluating their performance rather than genuinely participating. The study found that even when conversations went well by objective measures, high rehearsers felt dissatisfied, focusing on moments where they deviated from their script or didn't deliver lines as perfectly as rehearsed. The rehearsal had set an impossible standard that reality couldn't meet. They'd essentially guaranteed their own disappointment through the rehearsal process. Research on the physical manifestations of conversational rehearsal reveals body-based impacts. A 2020 study in psychosomatic medicine found that high rehearsers showed chronic muscle tension, particularly in the jaw, neck, and shoulders, from the constant mental activity. They had higher rates of tension headaches, TMJ disorders, and muscle pain. The mental rehearsal had physical costs. The study also measured sleep quality and found that conversational rehearsal frequently interfered with sleep. Participants reported lying awake rehearsing upcoming conversations, unable to quiet their mind enough to fall asleep, or waking in the middle of the night with scripts running through their head. The rehearsal didn't respect boundaries between waking and sleeping, invading rest periods and impairing recovery. Participants described feeling mentally exhausted despite adequate sleep duration, suggesting that the quality of rest was impaired by the ongoing cognitive activity. Some reported that even their dreams involved rehearsing conversations, suggesting the pattern had infiltrated unconscious processing. The brain couldn't rest from the constant simulation and preparation. For those watching who recognize yourselves as compulsive conversation rehearsers, I need you to understand something crucial. Your brain learned to do this to protect you. At some point, probably in childhood, spontaneous speech felt dangerous, and your brain developed rehearsal as a safety strategy. The intention was self-protection. But what started as protection has become a prison. The rehearsal isn't making you safer or better at conversations. It's consuming your cognitive resources, increasing your anxiety, impairing your conversational quality, preventing authentic connection, and exhausting you mentally and physically. You're preparing for performances that don't need to be performances, scripting interactions that work better when unscripted, trying to control something that's fundamentally uncontrollable, the spontaneous, unpredictable nature of human communication. The path forward isn't about learning to rehearse better or more efficiently. It's about learning to tolerate the discomfort of not rehearsing. Your brain will scream danger when you stop preparing. You'll feel vulnerable, exposed, anxious. But that's the old neural programming, not current reality. The catastrophic outcomes your brain predicts rarely happen. Most conversations go fine, even when unrehearsed. Often better because you're present and responsive rather than following a script. This means practicing unrehearsed conversations, starting with low-stakes interactions. Notice the urge to rehearse and choose not to. Sit with the discomfort of not knowing exactly what you'll say. Discover that you can navigate conversations spontaneously, that words come when needed, that awkward moments don't destroy relationships, that your unrehearsed self is enough. It means challenging every catastrophic thought that drives the rehearsal. I'll say something stupid becomes, most people say imperfect things in conversations, and it's fine. I'll be caught off guard becomes, brief pauses to think are normal and acceptable. They'll judge me becomes, most people are focused on themselves, not scrutinizing my every word. These aren't just positive thoughts. They're accurate thoughts that your anxious brain has been rejecting. It means building tolerance for imperfection in your speech. You will sometimes stumble over words. You will occasionally say things you wish you'd phrase differently. You will have moments of awkwardness. This is normal human communication. Perfection isn't the standard. Connection is. And connection happens through authentic presence, not through performed scripts. The science is clear. Conversational rehearsal is driven by anxiety, maintained by avoidance, and ultimately increases the very anxiety it's meant to reduce while impairing the conversational quality it's meant to improve. It's a maladaptive coping strategy that creates more problems than it solves. But the science also shows your brain can learn new patterns. You can develop comfort with spontaneity. You can build trust in your unrehearsed self. You can discover that you don't need extensive preparation to survive social interaction. The question is whether you're willing to risk the discomfort of stopping. Because continuing to rehearse is a certainty. You'll stay anxious, exhausted, inauthentic, trapped in mental simulations of conversations that will never match reality. Stopping is uncertain. You don't know what will happen when you're unrehearsed. But uncertainty is where growth lives. And the only way to discover that unrehearsed you is enough is to stop rehearsing and find out. Your brain has been protecting you through preparation. But maybe it's time to discover you don't need protection. Maybe the danger it's preparing you for isn't as catastrophic as it predicts. Maybe authentic, spontaneous, imperfect conversation is not just survivable, but actually the pathway to the genuine connection your rehearsed performances have been preventing. The script has kept you safe, but it's also kept you alone. The question is whether you're ready to put down the script and see what happens when you're just you.